My name is Helen Mayfield. I'm a postdoc here with Martin and Marin, and today I'm going to be presenting my work from the last 12 months. So thanks everyone for coming along. Today I'm going to be talking about using conceptual models to set benchmarks for species management in data core systems. First of all, I'm just going to go through with you the objectives of the project. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'm going to go through the New South Wales Saving Our Species program. We'll cover our case studies and give you some examples from each of them. Then we'll go through the guidelines themselves that we developed. And finally, we're going to jump forward a bit and look at some future work on evaluating the effect of site-based management on species viability. So we had two objectives for this postdoc. The first was to develop practical guidelines for setting benchmarks to evaluate the species response to management. The focus here being on developing practical, useful guidelines. And our second objective was we wanted to examine how this process could then be applied to evaluate the impact of these site-level actions on the overall species viability. Naturally, there were challenges, which is why we had a project. So the problem we've got is that threatened species management often takes place in these really data poor situations. So species can be cryptic, they can be hard to find, we could be really resource poor and just not be able to do the monitoring we want. And so in these situations, we often rely on our expert elicitation. But the problem we've got is the system that we're eliciting about is not always simple, it's generally really complicated. We're going to have lots of interactions, and there's going to be a lot of stuff that we don't know, and a lot of stuff that we know that we don't know. And so in these situations, it's actually really hard for our experts to actually put all these pieces together and come up with these numbers that we're asking them. So the idea is to give them a tool that they can use to do that. The other issue we have is that people are inherently bad at conditional probabilities and relative risks, especially when we ask them, tell me what you think will happen if we do this in a century, what will happen? It's a big ask, and so we want to try and step them through that. So, hooray, more guidelines, I hear you say. There are a lot of great guidelines out there. We've got guidelines for conceptual models, to select indicators, expert elicitation. Some of them probably written by people in this room. And these are all really great, and we really need these. So what we were adding to that is to try and give something that's going to give a complete process that are practical, so the actual experts themselves can sit down with the guidelines and work through them. They don't need we don't necessarily need a facilitated workshop. They don't need specialist data modelling knowledge, just something really practical and useful that they can use for themselves. So the work was done in partnership with the Saving Our Species program, which is an initiative of the New South Wales government. It aims to maximise the number of threatened species and ecological communities secure in the wild for the next 100 years, which is quite ambitious. Part of the way they do this is by dividing all the species up into different management streams that have different monitoring requirements. So we had case studies from 3 of these: site managed, landscape managed, and data deficient. So data deficient is the species where we genuinely don't know very much, and what we're trying to achieve by monitoring these is to get them into one of these other categories so we know what to do. Now, even though our guidelines are only developed using those 3 management streams, they're equally applicable to the ecological communities or any of those other streams. Now, monitoring and evaluation is at the heart of the Saving Our Species program, and they've got some pretty good solid guiding principles for how they want to do this. So transparency, objectivity, scientific rigour, cost effectiveness. Obviously we're working in government, we need to be making sure we're getting bang for our buck and we're achieving the most we can. And adaptive management. So we need to have something where we can learn as we go. As we get new information, we need to account for this. And we need to be able to be flexible. Now, we ran a series of workshops. We ran 4 workshops and 1 over the phone workshop. And our participants were OEH project coordinators, species managers, site coordinators, Plus we had external experts, some of which who had worked with the SOS program, others who had just worked with the species closely, sometimes for decades. And the reason for doing these workshops comes back to making these practical guidelines. So we wanted to really road test this notation and make sure that the people that we're developing the guidelines for actually understood them and could actually use them. So the other thing we wanted to do was create some case studies. For example, so when the guidelines come out shortly, you'll see in the back of them, there are 12 case studies for SOS species that show how these people worked through the guidelines to develop their conceptual models and whatnot. So if you're stuck, you don't know what to do, then you can see how someone else did it. And of course, we also wanted to get feedback from users. So we got some really good critical feedback during these workshops. We swapped things around a bit. We added a few bits in, and so just to make sure that these guidelines were really fit for purpose and the people who we wrote them for can actually use them. We didn't want to do one of those elicitation things where you go in, you give them a free lunch, you take their afternoon, and then you leave. So we were really lucky with our case studies. We had a wish list of 10, and we got 9 out of 10, and then we had 3 extras join in because they wanted to come to the workshop. 12 case studies. I'm a little bit in love with each of them. I think they're all fantastic. Throughout the workshops, I learned a lot about them, all of these different species. They ranged from vulnerable through to critically endangered, and we had the little toadlet here that's data deficient. We had some that had a really well-established monitoring plan, and then we had some that was one that was only discovered recently, so obviously we haven't got those decades worth of data. We have some that for monitoring and evaluation are relatively easy to find. Lots of the plants, they're there, they don't move around a lot. And then we had others that are scarce. So the Regent Honeyeater, we're talking about very few birds in a very large space. And orchids can be a bit tricky because they're underground a lot of the time. So don't worry, we're not at the end yet. You can't all go just yet. I just put this slide in the middle because these were our workshop participants, and these are the guys that made it happen. They showed up to the workshops, they gave us really good critical feedback. And so I really wanted to make sure that these guys get the acknowledgement they deserve, because without their effort to review the guidelines and give us feedback, we wouldn't have worked. So I think we did. Right, so now I'm just going to go through with you the actual framework that we developed. So it's a simple 5-step process. Simple. First we define our scope, then we develop our influence diagram, select our indicators, estimate our response to management for those indicators, and finally we select our benchmarks. So the first one, scope, no surprises here, says what goes on the tin. Just defines exactly which populations and sites we're including, which management actions we're considering in our estimates, anything that's specifically out of scope. For example, you might have one site that you know responds differently, so you can say we're not modelling that site. You might have some community groups doing a small amount of management actions, but you don't know if it's going to continue, so you might specifically say you're assuming that won't continue. And this is really, getting this bits right is critical for future interpretation. So if someone else comes along and looks at your estimates, they need to know exactly what it is you've modelled. So influence diagrams. This is one of the big main steps in the process. Now, influence diagrams, we need to do these because they're effective for capturing how the system works. So getting into the mechanics of why we expect our management actions to affect our species. They add transparency in the decision making, coming back to those core principles of the OAH monitoring and evaluation. Facilitate consensus to capture variation among experts. So we generally have between 1 and 3 experts on each species. This gave them a chance to sit down and check that they actually agreed on what their thoughts of the system were. And then just formalising the assumptions. So if we come along and say, well, why did you do that? You've got a model that says, well, we thought this was going to affect that. The notation, we wanted to keep it really simple. And so this was the notation that we found worked best in the workshops. simply A affects B. A negative sign is a negative relationship. So for example, an increase in foxes gives you a decrease in potoroos. So one goes up, one goes down. Positive relationship, pretty self-explanatory. One goes up, the other goes up, one goes down, the other goes down. So for example, here we've got our potoroo. Potoroos eat fungi, so we've got more fungi, we have more potoroos. Conversely, when the potoroos snuffle around and eat the fungi, they spread the spores. More potoroos, we get more fungi. That's how we model that. Uncertainty was a big one. A lot of experts, they thought there was a relationship. It's like, oh, well, we think maybe deer are a problem for dragonflies, we're not sure. But they were reluctant to put it in because they didn't want to be held accountable for it. So someone comes along and said, oh, you said this. So, but we still wanted to capture that information. That's why we let them put a dotted line to say, if you think there's a relationship, just put a dotted line. It means that they're not afraid to put that in there, but we still get that information. And magnitude. A lot of, some of the case studies, they know what the main threat is, and they really wanted to be able to indicate that this is the major cause. So we said, okay, just put a couple of plus signs or a couple of minus signs. And this sort of tells us relative which are the main threats. So I'm just going to go through an example. This is our long-nosed potoroo case study. So to develop the influence diagram, it's just we put down the species and then the dependencies. Let's jump forward. And then we add the threats. And finally, the management actions. And one of the nice things we found in the workshops with these influence diagrams was that with things like this, where we have interactions between our threats, they really appreciated the chance to be able to just sit down and have a tool and a notation to be able to really nut out the mechanics in those interactions. Now because we had a really simple notation, but we're not modelling simple systems, obviously we had a lot of questions. Interactions was a big one that people weren't really sure how to model, so we gave some examples for that. So for example, the giant dragonfly, the larvae live underground for a long time, like 6 years or something. If a fire comes along, you'll incinerate them. However, if the groundwater is higher, then the effect of that fire is less. So they wanted to model the interaction between the fire and the groundwater. We simply just suggested you put in a fire severity node. So here we've got fire intensity increases fire severity, but it's reduced by the groundwater level, which affects how many of your dragonfly larvae end up as little crispies. Bossier fragrans, really lovely little shrub, not little shrub, but beautiful little flowers. Critically endangered though. Found that affected by prolonged drought, but because the area occupied is quite small, this is the problem. So they wanted to say, well look, if they had more area, drought would be less of a problem if it covered a wider range. So we simply added the mortality from drought node there. So we can say prolonged drought affects mortality, area occupied, and that's what leads to that interaction. Nonlinear responses was another big one. So things like curly buck wattle for fire frequency. We found that some fire, it needs a little bit of fire, but then too much fire will actually destroy all the seedlings. And they wanted to be able to model that. Obviously we've got a really simple notation, so we've simply just said, well, you just put it in here, like this, and just make a note. So there's a lot of times we let them put them into assumptions if it let them communicate what they meant. Fire was one of our top three. So we had sort of three issues that came up again and again and again. Three aspects of fire was severity, frequency, and area burnt. So the different characteristics that they wanted to model. 9 out of 12 of our case studies directly mentioned fire. So our bristlebird, for example, they modelled that an increase in appropriate fire regime will lead to a decrease in tussock grass, which gives you an increase in bristlebird, so that's linked to habitat as well. Regent Honeyeater, again, another one of these response curves. So they're saying, well, occasional fire is good for our honeyeater because it will increase the habitat degradation. But if we have too much fire, then that's just going to wipe out the habitat. Cayley's grevillea was completely dependent on fire. So they made this really lovely sub-model for fire. Because they wanted to incorporate all of these different aspects. So, for example, they included area burnt, because if you have a larger area burnt, then you're going to get more overgrazing. If only a small area is burnt, you don't get that overgrazing effect. So, big one, climate change. This is one of the big questions we got, was experts saying, how do we model climate change? And our answer was, well, you don't. You have to model the effects of climate change. So we said you don't just write climate change equals less critters. You have to say exactly what it was that you expected it to do. So drought, fire, rainfall and temperature. And 11 out of 12 of our case studies specifically included one of those aspects. Curly white wattle, drought and fire. Long-nosed potoroo needs these suitable climatic conditions for fungal availability. Little toadlet here relies on temperature and rainfall, as much as we know. Remember, that's a dark species. And the eastern bentwing bat really relies on that roost microclimate. So they wanted to model that, saying, well, we don't know exactly what climatic conditions it needs, but we do know that if we have a deviation from that, we're going to have less bats in that roost. Habitat. So, they wanted to model the amount and the quality and multiple features. And it is going to be no surprise to anyone in this room that 12 out of 12 of our case studies had to model habitat and some aspect of what was threatening their species. Some of them it was pretty simple. Less habitat, less potoroos. More habitat, more grevillea. For others, they wanted to model some aspect of the quality. So, for example, with our broad-headed snakes, they wanted to model that exposed rocks were critical. We've got Glossier fragrans around there, tussock grass, so an aspect again of habitat degradation, as with our orchid. Now, coming back to our little toadlet, again, data deficient, they didn't know exactly what features of water quality were important, but they still really need to include it in the model because it is critical and water quality is under threat. So they simply put it on a subjective scale that's well defined from 1 to 10, so they can still monitor their water quality even though they don't know the exact components. So the scarlet robin, sweet little woodland bird, as you can see, massive implications of habitat. We've got habitat amount, but they also had to model the connectivity of the habitat and habitat structural complexity. So there was 3 different ways that these people, this case study modeled habitat. And interestingly, this was our only species that didn't specifically include climate change, which I think is probably because the habitat is such an overreaching problem for it. So, conceptual model's done. So now we know why we expect things to react in a certain way. We need to have a look at what it is we're going to monitor to see if we're right. So these are indicators. We want to pick a measure of the species being managed, as well as a measure of each threat being managed. Now we need to do both these things because they're not necessarily going to happen in tandem. We might find that, well, yes, we've managed our foxes, we've measured that, we now have less foxes. But if our potoroo is not doing anything, not increasing, we really haven't succeeded. Likewise, we might manage our foxes and find that, okay, great, potoroos are increasing, but go back and find actually monitoring foxes, we haven't done anything. There's something else going on that we've missed. They need to reflect system changes. They also need to be within a relevant time frame, so there's no point saying, well, we're going to plant some trees and then we're going to, in 5 years' time, measure how many hollow-bearing trees we have, because you're not going to have any more. So you need to make sure your indicators are relevant to the time period. Those should be measurable, and of course, coming back, have to be cost-effective. So using influence diagram to do this, we look to select indicators that are as close as possible to exactly what we want to measure. So these guys measure of their species, as well as a measure of the threats being managed. And the second part of indicators is to look at exactly what you're going to measure, and exactly how you're going to measure it. So these guys show occupancy in line with their existing monitoring programs to incorporate those. They also wanted to make sure that they were monitoring the number of hectares under a suitable fire regime. So now we know what it is we're going to monitor. We need to know exactly what we expect to happen. So the other thing is, what we want to know what success would look like. So we want to measure our indicators, and if we get the values we expect, great, the species is responding as expected. But we also need to know what it would look like if the species wasn't responding as expected. And that's why we need to have these counterfactual scenarios in there. So our experts estimated 4 different scenarios. So a no management intervention. So if we just walked away and did nothing, so lack of intervention really. Continuation of the pre-SOS intervention. So sometimes before this program came along, they were already doing a little bit of fox management, for example. The SOS intervention is currently scheduled, so most of them are due to run for 5 years. So showing what they thought would happen, if we just did these management actions and walked away after 5 years, how would that affect it? And finally, our best case scenario, what if we could just continue doing our management action for 100 years? We got them to estimate their highest, lowest, and best guess for each of those indicators over 5 different time periods. Now, another important thing with the guidelines here is that this is a big ask. We're saying, what do you reckon is going to happen in 100 years? Obviously, no one knows for sure. So what we do is we try and step them through. We say, well, what's going to happen in 1 year? Have a think about it. Look at your influence diagram. Then what's going to happen in 5 years? Now think forward to 20 years. And now think forward to 100 years. You still get some pretty funny looks. You do get a lot of kickback in workshops when you tell people to do this. But with enough Tim Tams and stepping them through, they can come up with these numbers. The other trick we've got is this: we let them say their confidence. We don't expect anyone to say, some of them, the only time they're confident is I'm 100% sure that species will not be there if we walk away. But for these actual values, if you can give them a confidence, they're much more likely to be able to come up with a number, because they can say, well, I think this is going to happen. And that's pretty much all you can ask of anyone, to predict a century away. So just to give you an idea of how this played out for our case study, for our Potoroo, this is the estimates for fox occupancy. So basically, if we don't manage it, fox occupancy is going to go up. If we manage it for a bit and then walk away, it'll go down for a bit, but eventually it goes up. If we just keep managing as we are, nothing will change. But if we do this extra management, you can see that after a couple of years, we are going to get this gradual decline. So that's important. We need to know that, well, it's not going to happen straight away, it's going to be gradual, so we can't just expect foxes to suddenly disappear. Cats, basically there's no management going on, so if we just leave it as is, nothing will change. We've managed for a bit, they'll go down for a bit, and then they'll bounce back to their level. And then But if we manage them constantly, we will get this slight reduction. Obviously, suitable fire regime, if we don't manage it, we're at the mercy of lightning and drought and all those other things, so we can't really predict how suitable that's going to be. So, what does all of this mean for our adorable, fuzzy little potteroo? Basically, this species has to be continually managed for it to work. If we just manage it for 5 years and stop, all those other factors are going to kick in. We haven't actually had a long-term impact. And this comes to setting our benchmarks. So what we've got for our benchmarks here is simply, this is just the values that we expect to happen. So we derive them from the estimated values. We pick a range of values that we want it to fall between rather than picking just a single value, because obviously there's a bit of flexibility in this. We can't predict exactly what's going to happen. As I mentioned before, we need to have short and long-term benchmarks, things that necessarily, we're not going to see the massive change that we need straight away, necessarily. And we need to be able to update them with new information. So here you can sort of see, these are the values we would pick. For 2036, we pick the lowest and highest estimates. That's the important bit. If our observed values fall outside this range, this is when we need to go back to that influence diagram we created and look at what went wrong. We need to look at our monitoring, say, well, okay, was our management action not successful in reducing the threat, or did the species not respond to that reduction as we thought? So you need to go back to your conceptual model, have a look at it and say, okay, well, what did we get wrong? And you need to be prepared to update that. So that's basically the framework we came up with. And we got some really good feedback, eventually, from the workshops. Like I said, we had some people who came on to the workshops just because they wanted help modelling their species, and we had some who we invited to the workshops, so we had a really good range of people to give us feedback. A lot of them felt that by doing these conceptual models and stepping through these processes, it really helped them to be able to clarify their assumptions and communicate their knowledge of the system. Now, this was really important, they felt, because things like staff turnaround on a project, if you leave your project, that information is all in your head, it goes with you. If they've got these conceptual models, they've at least got it on paper. It also means when new people come in, you can bring them up to speed quickly, say this is exactly what we think is happening. It helped them identify relationships between the species and threats, experiment. All the information came from the head, so they already knew about them, but just having a tool and some time to sit down and write them really helped. They liked that you could update the plans in their management, the models in their management plans as new information came to light. And for some of them, it helped them identify gaps in the knowledge. It's when they went to write it down in a conceptual model and they would hesitate and say, actually, and they'd end up putting a dotted line on it, well, maybe I'm not as sure of that as I thought. So that is, in a nutshell, the guidelines. So that's the first part of work that we did. The second part, which is still a work in progress, so don't be too harsh. We wanted to look at what is the contribution of site level management to overall species viability. And the way we're thinking of doing this is going to be to use Bayesian networks. But first we had to sort of look at our case studies and split them up. So we thought through that, well, look, our case studies, they differ in whether or not the estimated values of the indicators include the entire population of the species. So, for example, did they say, well, this is 100% of my population, this is what's going to happen to that species? Or did they model maybe 2 out of the 3 sites and say, we're going to give you estimates for these sites? The second thing was, did the scope include the entire range of the species? So, for example, did we, with potteroos, might cover the whole range, or with bats, they might have just modelled a bat roost, or for a migratory species, they may just have modelled the breeding area. third thing that differed in is whether or not that conceptual model that they did actually accurately reflects all sites. So we might know that some sites are going to respond very differently. Don't panic, I'm going to go through examples. It's okay. So we put this into a little bit of a flowchart thing. So if the estimated indicator values are for the entire species, so we've modelled the entire population, and the scope of the estimates include the entire range, hooray, we're done. We don't need to do anything. We already know how it's going to affect the population. If, however, we find that we've estimated indicator values for the whole species, so those response to management curves cover every individual, but we haven't got the entire range. So, for example, the Regent Honeyeaters and migratory species, they modelled mainly the breeding, the rest of the breeding range, without modelling where the birds go over winter. That's good, we can still use those estimates, but we just need to be careful that we haven't got all the information that we need. If we've got those we don't have the entire species modelled, so maybe they modelled 1 or 2 different sites out of 5 sites, or just the species population in New South Wales, not in general. But that conceptual model's for the same site. So we've got our whole species, so we've got part of our species population, but we expect them to all respond the same to management. Then that way we can actually do something. So we can adjust our estimates according to the proportion of the population under each management strategy. Don't worry, there's an example coming up. So if we haven't monitored the entire, if we haven't estimated the entire species, but we know that some sites are going to respond differently to management, we need to handle that slightly differently because we can't just add these up. So this is the category, this third category here is the one where we can do the most, easiest. So this is just an example of one where we're thinking of doing it. This is not necessarily going to be the final one. So we've got our expert elicited values here. We can take these values, so for example, if we're modelling in 100 years, we simply take the highest, lowest and best guess, and we can model that as a distribution of probability of what we think is going to happen. So, don't panic. So if we don't manage the species, so we've got 40,000 bats, 2009. If we don't manage the species, we have no contribution from managed bats, none for our pre-SOS management. This is what we expect is going to happen. So we're going to have probably around 1,000 bats, but chances are we'll have no bats. And that's if we don't manage any of them. If we take those same 40,000 bats, but this time we're managing them. We're doing these management actions for the next 100 years. What we find then is that we expect we'll have more like 40 to 50,000 bats. Same population, now we're just managing them. But what we want to know is if our management actions only includes half the bats, so maybe we're just managing a couple of roosts. What contribution will this have overall? And to do that, we can take these distributions. So this is, we manage 50% of our bats are managed, and 50% of our bats aren't managed. We can now see that actually, we expect there to be sort of about 20,000 bats. Bats probably aren't going to go extinct because we're managing that one site, but we're not going to get the same massive increase we thought if we were managing all of them. So this is our last example, is the bristlebird, looking at category, final category. Bristlebirds, as I'm sure Zoe happily tell you. We've got the eastern population and the northern population and the southern central population. The northern population is very small, but also responds very differently to management. So those management actions aren't necessarily going to work. So in these, we can still model this, we just have to do it slightly differently. So now we model the sites separately. We say, this is our northern population, this is our southern population. If we don't manage either, this is what we'll expect to happen. These are just rough numbers, these are not real numbers, they're just for demonstration purposes only. So don't get too complacent that bristlebirds are okay. If we constantly manage it, consistently manage both sites, we expect this population to do well, and overall they're going to do quite well. But by modelling it this way, what we can see is that if we don't manage this population, overall the species is fine. So management of this population will have a big impact on our species success. But we need to be aware that this population is not going to be okay if we don't manage it. So we can't just manage them all the same. That, I believe. Yeah. So just a few caveats on that work. So all of these response to management estimates, we're assuming that we don't get these big random catastrophic events. So we're not getting white-nosed fungus for the bats, citron for the frogs, catastrophic fire for bristlebirds, which is a big assumption. It's assuming the sites are independent. There are a lot of other assumptions. We are gradually working through these, so watch this space, and we hope to have an update on that for you. With that, ladies and gentlemen, it's me done.